Hello and welcome to this series. So in the following video, I will show you how to bake a normal map inside 3ds Max. So first things first, you need to know a couple of things that we will cover in this video. The first thing that we are going to cover up is to know what baking is. So as you can see on the screen, there are some texts that I have typed down. So baking in terms of 3D, we will understand what it is in terms of texture maps. So baking maps is same as baking a meal. So for people who actually find baking kind of hard for them and have problems, just know that the way you cook a meal, it's that same way as baking something. For example, to bake a cake, you need eggs and baking powder and all the other ingredients that you need. And once you bake it, then you have a final product, which cannot be altered, of course. Let's say you want to make that cake, you will need to bake that cake again. So same way is with textures, you will need to bake it again. But in terms of texture maps, baking is pretty much the same. To do that, you actually have to give it some data, which is stored inside of these maps. In our case, we will be using normal maps. As you can see in the points that I have written down, that different type of texture maps store different data. For example, if you want to store color, you will have to bake a diffuse map. As for the normal map, which calculates the lighting angle, as well as it also stores the high resolution details, it bakes it into a light vector. And I do not know much about that because it is kind of an advanced topic, the way it works. But from what I know is that it also like the in the vertex shader, it is also like there is a normal which calculates the lighting angle and everything else. So you guys can look that up, but you don't need to know these much details. But pretty much using this technique, you can bake any type of texture other than a normal map to inside of 3ds Max. So, and another thing, a map basically it refers to a texture. So we usually call them maps. For example, for a color texture, we will call it a diffuse map. Something that calculates the roughness, you can either call it a specular, which calculates the lighting, and the roughness tells how smooth or rough it will be. And they have different formats. Some of them are your basic picture ones, such as the JPEG, the PNG format, the Targa file, which is most common with Photoshop. We have Direct Draw Surface, DDS used with DirectX games. And we also have the bitmap file. And there are different compression formats which are used for different type of texture channels. Let's say that your texture only stores the red, green, and blue channels. It will have a DXT1, DXT3, 5, BC7 for the alpha channel as well for different sizes and compressions. And yeah, you don't really need to know this all for this type of lecture, so let's move on. Here you can see that we actually have to know another thing, which is projection itself. What is projection? Projection is basically, as you can see here in this picture, is that we are actually projecting a high poly model on top of a low poly one. And here you can see that this is a projection cage, and we have actually baked the diffuse here, which you can see, which will be further converted into a normal map, which we will see in the next slide here. So now, once this baking process is done, we have baked a perfect normal map. Here you can see in the screenshot, there is the model, and it is baked on a surface plane, which you can see right here. Here is the baked normal map. And for this video, I will provide the 3D model, which I have used. I actually sculpted this inside of ZBrush, and I know it's not that detailed, but this was just for practice. So I will provide this in the description as well as everything else that is required here. So you don't have to worry about this. So yeah, here is the normal map, and here are some more examples that you can achieve using the same technique inside of 3ds Max. Here you can see I have a skull normal map baked inside of 3ds Max. And here you can see another demonstration screenshot, which I have pasted here. So basically I have the high poly skull right here, and on top of it I have done a retopology of a low poly model, and I have baked it, and this was the normal map which was generated using this. Here you can see the diffuse. I really didn't need the diffuse, and yeah, it has some kind of flaws because I separated it and I needed it as one piece. But yeah, I will show you this as like the simplest tutorial ever. we will be using this model here for this tutorial. So, but here is like the results you can achieve. Here you can see like the details are mapped perfectly. And I will also like show you a screenshot in the next comparing both the low poly and the high poly model. Anyways, here is another example of this. Here you can see that there are a lot of models here, and yeah, this is a large texture. This was around 4K in quality, if I remember. Like this was a 4096 by 4096 texture. It had some parts of the armor, the skin, some graftings, the clothes, the materials, and the weapons and all. So yeah, you can bake them like this as well. And here is a comparison of the model. Here is the high poly model that I made inside ZBrush by sculpting it. And here is just a simple flat plane which I projected the model on. But here, this is not a normal map. I have just applied the normal map as a diffuse texture here, which is the color, just to see how it looks. And here is the final rendering result. Here you can see that the high poly model is there, and just so you know, the colors and the shading are looking a bit different. I kind of like adjusted the shader so it looks a bit brighter like this. But yeah, there isn't much difference, sorry, other than the lighting and the color. It's basically the shader difference, but you can see like this is literally a single polygon, and this was around like a million, around 1,095,000 polygons. So you can see there is like absolutely no loss of details. So this is what we will be covering up. But before we start the tutorial, you need to just remember 5 steps. The first one is that you must have a low poly model on which you need to have the details projected on. As you can see, I had a high poly model. So first things first, I made a low poly model, which was a flat plane. Like it literally had nothing. But let's say you want to add some depth into it. So you will actually need more geometry there. But for now, let's just keep it simple. You will need to have a low poly model. Second thing is that you will need to have UVs, which are basically texture coordinates that tell like the U stands for horizontal and V for vertical, and the W is usually the Z-axis in terms of 2D because a flat paper, it only has the X-axis and the Y-axis, but the W is like, it's rarely used. It's for like really complex geometry, sometimes for 2D graphics or so, but we will just stick with the U and V's. Like the U stands for horizontal and the V for vertical. So another thing that confused me a lot when I was learning these maps myself, I used to think like the polygon count of the high poly is really a lot. And a misconception that I had was that you actually do not need to have UVs on the high poly model. You need to create a low poly model and give it UVs. That's it. You don't need UVs on the high poly model because I used to think that the UV map of the high poly model and the low poly must match, and then we project details. And this really, really, really made it frustrating for me to learn. So yeah. So first things first, have a low poly model, then apply a UV map on here. The retopology process we will not be covering in this video. Next thing, we need to add a projection cage, which is shown here. As you can see, the high poly model is placed right in front of the plane. You cannot see the plane here, but if you see here, you can see the wireframe here. The wireframe here, you can leave it as a single one, but I like to triangulate my models for optimization for testing purposes inside of game engines. As you guys might be aware that triangulating them optimizes it, but you can leave it as a single big polygon too, you will get the same result. So like that's the same model here it's applied on, okay? Next thing, we need to actually align our two models, which you can see here. We need to align both of them, which was shown here. Here you can see in the wireframe mode that the high poly and the low poly model both are overlapping. You can see some distortions here, like the teeth are having the distortion. That's because the lower model is the high, like by lower I mean the one behind it is the high poly, and on top of it is the low poly model. And yeah, all the stuff was applied. It's just not shown here, and I just baked it. So yeah, we need to align them and like make sure that the projection cage, as you can see here, is actually passing through here. I will cover that in the next video. And then we just simply need to choose the format that we need here, which we discussed earlier in the video. We will need to pick a format in which you need your normal map or any texture you're baking in, and you can adjust the compression method yourself in Photoshop or GIMP or whatever you use. And finally, you can just then save it and then hit bake, and then it will bake you the map like this, and you can get some good final results like seen here. Now, I will make a second part of this video, which will actually demonstrate this practically how to do this inside of 3ds Max.